All right, let's focus on the United States now. Central Washington is an armed fortress fenced off with razor wire and surrounded by 25,000 National Guard troops ahead of President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration tomorrow. Now, that's in stark contrast to previous inaugurations when the U.S. Capitol celebrated for days. The COVID-19 pandemic has already cancelled the inaugural balls. Now the National Mall is closed to the public due to threats of violence from groups who attacked the U.S. Capitol on January the 6th. Almost none of the public will witness firsthand the transition of power, souring the mood of Washington residents, but the flags will be out, possibly as many as 200,000 from all over America. Previous inaugurations sometimes drew over 1 million spectators to the National Mall to watch the ceremony from giant television screens and the new president parading on foot from the Capitol to the White House. Balls and parties in hotel ballrooms and convention halls across the city featured guests with champagne and music from A-list stars. So the inauguration of Joe Biden as the next U.S. president will be so different in so many ways, a reflection not only of the dangers of COVID-19, but also perhaps of the state of the U.S. democracy. To discuss, we're joined by Professor John Stremlau, who served previous U.S. presidents before his academic career here in South Africa. Also, senior researcher at the trade collective Lebohang Pheko. Thank you both for being with me tonight. John, if we can start with you, the security contingent here is unprecedented. On the right, if we say Fox News is on the right, there are claims about this being a real show of force, unnecessary by the Democrats, also concerned that the mostly white male cops are being vetted. Apparently they have to say that they're politically neutral. Is there overreach here, or is this all fair enough given what happened earlier in January?
Well, I think you've given a very good overview of the security situation and the response, which seems to me to be fully justified. But what I'm holding my breath looking forward to is the actual swearing in. You know, it's only a 35-word oath, and it ends with my ability to preserve, protect, and defend the U.S. Constitution, which is an acknowledgement that no man is above the law, as Mandela so eloquently reminded South Africans often. And Donald Trump ignored that, and that's why he's being impeached a second time. But the election was conducted freely, fairly, and it was certified by all 50 states. So Biden is the legitimate president and will be inaugurated tomorrow, but under these extraordinary circumstances. But I'm glad that this oath is going to be articulated every time since 1789.
So Lebohang, looking at the security, this extraordinary situation, like Prof. Stremlau said, is it a reflection not only of COVID, but the years of Trump's rule, and maybe even a reflection of a weaker U.S. democracy?
And also the idea of what democracy has become in the U.S. I think that the sort of the shambolic insurrection that took place on January the 6th, basically a domestic coup d'etat, which hadn't been seen. I don't think that there'd been that kind of domestic insurrection in the U.S. for a couple of 100 years, actually, since the days of the Civil War, would indicate that the forms of democracy that the U.S. has exported to the world and imposed across the world have been gradually, and I think, in my opinion, in diminishing because of their overweening interest in, I think, imposing their will, and this notion of the coalition of the willing on others, whilst in fact their own internal infrastructure, the democratic dividend, the racial divisions, the deep racial oppression, and so forth, the deep social divide, of course, massive Gini coefficient in the U.S. The several worlds, economic worlds, reside in one country, and this is something that we don't often see from the outside. I think that it's actually an inevitable deterioration of many years, many generations of neglect, perhaps of overly inward-looking, and a slightly self-congratulatory view of themselves, not also understanding that the world has shifted quite significantly over the past 50 or 60 years.
Well, Lebohang, staying with you, I think we spoke about this earlier, that many people felt the US shouldn't even comment on Uganda's elections after what happened. Have recent events really undermined the moral authority of the US in the eyes of many Africans?
I think I'll repeat what I said when we spoke previously, which is that for some of the reasons that I've just articulated, I don't think that the US has ever had real moral authority. I think that what they have had is the ability to corral a kind of an imperial imagination and help and use their hegemonic power. What they are is one of the real, and I think the last great hegemonic powers. And I think hegemony is not just about political and economic power across the world. It's also about the ability to reproduce ideas. And what they've done very well is to reproduce the idea that America is great, to reproduce the idea that America has got moral authority, is a fantastic democracy, which of course for several people in the US it is not. And I think of course for people across the world who have had the onslaught of the US style invasiveness, so across Latin America, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Cuba have been on the back of the beast for many years, across African countries, enforced coups d'etats, regime change, extrajudicial killings, and so forth. The debacle with Colonel Gaddafi, the other debacle with Saddam Hussein, and so on and so forth. So I think that this idea that America has always had moral authority, I think has been very flimsy at best, and the flimsiness of it, the fallacy of it, was only exposed and imploded in a very particular, visceral way on January the 6th. And yes, indeed, I think that if we're speaking of the community of countries and community of equals, we should also be sending electoral observers to the US, to the UK, and so forth, because I think that kind of top-down colonial construct of European and Western countries having a hegemony and a monopoly over what is and is not correct in terms of democracy is very problematic and quite outdated.
Yeah. John, would you like to comment on some of the things that she said? I imagine you to be a patriotic, proud American, but I know you also believe that Trump has been the worst president in the history of the States.
Well, I do, but I think it ought to be pointed out that having lived through the Vietnam War and the Iraq invasion when I was over here, I am under no illusions about the weaknesses and flaws in American democracy. The sediments of slavery run very deep in the bloodstream of America. What I do have some hope for, however, is that with Biden and Kamala Harris, and against the backdrop of this terrible Trump years, maybe, just maybe, this endless struggle to try to consolidate and sustain democratic governance, which after all was formed in 1789 by a bunch of slaveholders who nevertheless felt that you could not trust majority rule without checks and balances. But on the other hand, you could not run the risk of another tyrant. And in a sense, they have made that Constitution continue, but it needs very much to be reformed. South Africa has a human rights constitution. The U.S. is a states' rights constitution, 50 separate states. In some ways, though, it may be instructive to regional economic communities here that are trying to aggregate sovereign states. I don't know. But it's a very critical moment in the U.S. history, as you all know, and this is going to be determinative whether or not the country can sustain its democratic experiment.
Yeah.
Lauded as it.
John, staying with you, what about trust from the international community? So Joe Biden is coming in. He's going to rejoin the Paris Accord, for example, looking at climate change. But now is there not that underlying possibility that things could swing again to an alternative reality in the US? So suddenly international agreements with the United States become tricky.
Well, of course, this is a transition that is fraught with hazards. And what we've seen in South Africa is the growing pains of a young democracy. The question is sort of interesting to me is whether or not there is a basis for a renewed discussion between the United States and South Africa, very different nations, but sharing a searing racist, white supremacist histories in both, and whether or not you can build on this because the world is still comprised of 193 sovereign states. And if you're going to move to a more human rights-based international regime, you're going to have to build that slowly, as the African Union is trying to do. Perhaps Biden can at least be supportive of that process, not negligent and dismissive of it as Donald Trump was.
Lebohang, how do you feel? There's some hope there expressed that Joe Biden can change things. Are you hopeful?
I'm not entirely sure. The thing with, the thing is that President Trump has done a few things that are quite interesting. And the one is that he has ratified 3 Supreme Court justices, and he's also ratified about over 200 federal court judges, which gives the judiciary a conservative leaning that is going to be intergenerational. And there's very little that Biden can do, I think President-elect Biden can do about that. The other thing as well that he's done is to then ensure that there are tax cuts and these massive reforms that are generational. But he's kind of managed to put into the ether the notion that these cuts are for the ordinary people, the ordinary Joes, the ordinary, your Charlottesville brigade, so to speak. And yet, in fact, we know that corporates, America, has been the biggest beneficiary of these tax cuts. And again, contrary to Trump's propaganda or fake news, as he would coin it, is the notion that he's created more jobs than any other U.S. president. In fact, he has lost more jobs than any other U.S. president, at least over the last 100 years. So, in fact, President-elect Biden comes in with challenges which I think very similar to the ones that President Roosevelt had to come in with in the 1930s. And then, of course, thinking around the social compact and what that would mean at a time, of course, of great despondency. And I think a time, of course, when there was the need to then, there was a deep distrust. There's a deep distrust, I think, right now in institutions. I think even the notion of truth is waging war with itself, the factionalism within let alone between the Democrats and the Republicans. And I think that, President Trump has really done great damage to bipartisan politics, but also what is left of the Republican Party as well in the wake of Trumpism. It's really a fragmented hot mess of a thing at the moment. And then, of course, that's even not going to international relations and the loss of internationalism, or the very strange internationalism that the unusual counterlogical internationalism that outgoing President Trump, utilized. So, his strange alliances, strange to the U.S. With the leadership of North Korea, of Russia, and so on. But again, as I said previously, in illustrating some of the double standards, the hypocrisy, or perhaps the complexities of what human international relations mean today, when in fact, institutions like NATO, like the G7, are not sort of have to be more than the quaint, white-led, European-led institutions that they were. And I think for me, one of the interesting moments, or the punchline moments, is when President Trump tried to have a G7 meeting at his own golf course in Florida. I mean, do you think that this is really all about a group of people who are coming to your backyard? But I also think that illustrates that he has never really relinquished his corporate interests. That's another thing that has flown under the radar in the midst of all of this talk of impeachment, is that he really never relinquished his own. I sometimes got the impression that he was running the U.S. as a very high-octane hobby, rather than being vested in the way that somebody like John Kennedy would have said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country.
John, would you like to comment? There's lots of talk of Biden using his executive powers in the early days to start undoing some of Trump's legacy. But how do you deal with that global reputation and unite a very divided country? You can't do that with executive orders.
No, you cannot, and it's going to be hard work for everyone. But I'm very impressed with the diversity and the talent that he's assembled, starting with Kamala Harris as his vice president, which is breaking a number of precedents in itself. But his other appointments, the senior appointments, were under consideration by the Congress now. Biden knows the Congress and how it operates. It's a very slow-moving ship, but it's going to have to speed up to address the kind of problems we've been talking about tonight. And I think the executive actions at least give some momentum. Lift the Muslim ban tomorrow, rejoin WHO tomorrow, rejoin the climate change accord tomorrow. He can do all those things. He'll do a dozen or so executive actions tomorrow, but that's only a very small down payment. He needs legislation to approve this $1.9 trillion very progressive recovery plan that would at least give relief to those most seriously affected. 25 million Americans are in danger of being evicted from their homes. He's going to have to do that very, very fast by executive order, but also by legislation. And fortunately, he's had 50 years in government, and he ought to know where all the bodies are buried, and he's changed and evolved, and I hope he grows into this job.
Lebohang, finally, Kamala Harris, that's a good point. Does she really change the game for you in terms of racial inequalities, discrimination? And I mean, put this all into focus, given that it was the birthday anniversary of Martin Luther King this week.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm very, very wary of the politics that suggest that, you can just take any woman or any black person and that somehow represents a transformational structural shift. It really does not. And I think that we saw that. I'm not sipping the same Kool-Aid that many of us sipped under President Obama, for example. And I think that in as much as the power of symbolism is important, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris's personal feminist politics, black politics, don't impress me immensely. But that said, she's as good as any white man would be in this position. But I do want to say that linking with Martin Luther King's legacy, that you raise an interesting question, that it's a cynical thing that outgoing President Trump has done to release a very divisive report, just as on the day of MLK, which was in response to a commission established last year in the wake of the Black Lives Matter marches and demonstrations, which is really talking about bringing about transformative education as part of the U.S. curriculum, bringing race politics, social politics, and really reorientating the idea of what Americanism means. And in fact, it's been, he's been very aggressive, very hostile, him and his acolytes, saying that it's almost suggesting that it's terrorist, that it's revisionist, and so forth, as though any of us can contest that slavery did happen, that black bodies are being brutalized in the U.S. And I think that it's quite interesting that at a time such as this, Martin Luther King, who was a very radical man in many respects, I mean, his 6-point plan, which speaks about the right to have a living wage, the right to have efficient income, the right to have access to capital, and deep inequalities. His pro-poor campaign, he had an economic bill of rights, is miles away from the kind of Santa Claus politics that he has been reduced to of I have a dream, and the perversion that his words that talk about not judging a person by the color of their skin, but the content of their character, which even far-right fascists, quite frankly, have then perverted for their own nefarious gain. So exactly why that kind of curriculum is extremely important to situate historical Black and American struggles, but also important to situate and to make those intergenerational links of the struggles that did not happen only yesterday. I think what Trump has only done is to illustrate how deeply embedded these issues are.
All right, thank you both. I wish we could chat further, but we have to leave it there. Incisive commentary as always. That was Professor John Stremlau from WITS and Lebohang Pheko from the Trade Collective. And of course, tomorrow we'll bring you all the live action, and we'll take you live to the United States tonight after 8 o'clock.